We are fortunate to have Laura Ackerman and Eric Owens on the call with us today. So we're going to hear from some very knowledgeable people in the org to learn more about the laws behind accessibility, our considerations as we create content, and policy and reviews will be covered by Eric towards the end. So I'm just going to share my screen and get us started. So today's focus is particularly accessibility in the digital realm, since we are moving so many programs and so many documents digital at this time. And Laura Ackerman with AgroAbility is going to start us off. So Laura, you can take over.
Alrighty, so we're talking today about why do you need to have accessible materials? Well, for one thing, can you switch to, there we go. There are a number of federal laws. These are the three that I'll highlight today. And I included the dates because I know this can feel like all of a sudden they're asking us to do that. Well, all of a sudden is not really all of a sudden. So back in 1968, the Architectural Barriers Act said that buildings and facilities must comply with federal standards for physical accessibility. We're not talking about physical buildings or facilities today, but I know there are a lot of college and extension people online, and often that is a consideration. The really big one to look at here is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504. Under this section, no qualified individual with a disability may be discriminated against in any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So the college, the university gets money, federal money, extension does. So that's something, so 1973, we need to be aware of that, and that includes employment, it includes communications, which obviously at the time there was no internet, but your phone, your transportation, so anything that you did had to be accessible. We skip up to the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life: jobs, schools, transportation, communication, telecommunications, any public and private places that are open to the general public. Again, that impacts us, and that can impact us with partners who are not necessarily connected to Ohio State, but still we present with, we collaborate with. Okay, next slide, please. So when you're thinking of who's a person with a disability, the easiest one to think of right off is something that you can see. So an obvious disability. Someone who is visually impaired and has a white cane or a seeing eye dog, or someone who is hearing impaired and is using ASL or has an ASL interpreter, a person in a wheelchair, but it also includes invisible disabilities. And the Americans with Disabilities Act defines a disability as a person with a disability as anyone who has physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. They have a history or a record of such impairment, or they are perceived by others as having such impairment. So quite frequently, people who are hearing impaired do not think they have a disability. To them, deafness is not a disability. Other people might see it that way. And I wanted to make a note that the ADA does not name the impairments. There are too many. There are certainly things that keep coming up and being discovered now, but basically this is what you need to look at the framework for a person who has a disability. Next slide, please. And when you think that I don't know anybody, nobody comes to my events, I don't know anybody that has a disability. Well, 14.1% of Ohioans do have a disability. This is according to 2010 census data. And this was self-reported. So at some point in their lifetime, 70% of all Americans have either a temporary or a permanent disability. Temporary maybe being a broken limb or after effects from a surgery or an illness. 21% of Americans aged 15 and over have a disability, and as we get older, 50% of Americans 65 and older presently have some sort of a disability. So there are a lot of people who do have a disability, whether it's obvious or it's not obvious. Next slide, please. And our goals for creating accessibility, I look at the ADA very simply as the golden rule. How do you want someone to treat you? treat others that way. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I know I personally am extremely independent. I don't want to have to ask for help, certainly not into watching a webinar, reading a fact sheet, going to the county fair, any of those things. I want to be able to show up and do them. So we want you to be, when you're planning your programming, when you're writing documents, when you're planning an event, we want you to be proactive and not reactive. Think how much easier it is to have it planned, it's done in advance. You don't have to rush in the moment and try to get things done, try to find a sign language interpreter last minute, try to create documents that are accessible, trying to make a physical site accessible. So again, like I said, remember the golden rule. How would you want to interact with that program, that site, that event, that document? Probably without any restrictions and without having to ask people for help. So this is the golden rule that we want to go by. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. We appreciate you taking the lead on the presentation. So now that we've kind of talked about the why, we're going to get into considerations while creating content. And this is a very high level view that we're going to take. So it will apply to all kinds of digital content that you create and even print content. So today we're just going to be talking at a high level view about those considerations. One of the first things is fonts. We want all of your text to be readable, and it needs to be in a large enough size and a style that is generally readable. So the good news is that the brand fonts they meet those requirements. So just, don't put things in tiny font, and try not to use script font for anything other than is really necessary. Just keep it simple, keep it readable. Just think about how many people need glasses or bifocals, or how tired your eyes get at the end of the day reading a screen. So just keeping these fonts, in a reasonable size and style will help everyone. And along with that is color and contrast. So this goes into readability. Certainly we want good color contrast in our fonts so you can read the font on top of the background without much trouble. And this also carries over to graphs and any sort of vector images that you might create or designs that you might create. So something in a PowerPoint or something you make in InDesign. Choose colors with a high enough contrast to pass the WebAIM contrast checker. And I put a screen capture of what this website looks like, and I include it in the resources later so you can kind of go check it out. It's super handy. You just put in a color value for your foreground and your background color, and it'll give you a contrast ratio. And the site, don't worry, you do not need to remember all of this. The site lays out exactly what standards your color contrast ratio passes, what they don't pass, and what those considerations are for what's counted as large text, what's counted as small text. So this website is super helpful. And even if someone isn't necessarily visually impaired, I've noticed a lot of people perceive color differently just on the general scheme of things. So keeping your contrast pretty high is going to help everybody read your content more easily. And then the other thing that we need to be thinking about is that color should not be the only means of communicating information. With individuals who might be colorblind or not perceive color as distinctly as others, if you have, for example, 2 stars in a graph or something that are supposed to mean something, and one is red and one is green, they may not be able to tell the difference between those 2 items in your content. So as an example, this graph I put in the right, it's certainly not complete, and it doesn't have useful information in it, but I just wanted to point out a very simple way to define those lines differently than just with color. You'll see that one is dashed, one has dashes and dots, and one is a solid line. And I also edited the settings to make those lines a little bit thicker. So you can adjust settings and graphs and diagrams to make things easier to read. And just be mindful that color is not the only way that you're communicating things. Does anybody have any questions right now? I don't want to get too far ahead if there are questions. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so we're going to press on. Document formatting can really help with screen reader capabilities if a visually impaired person needs a screen reader, or perhaps somebody who just processes information better with audio. If you use built-in format options in Word, such as headings or numbered lists, you can really go a long ways in creating a solid document structure that is much easier for a screen reader to navigate and communicate meaningful information to the person relying on a screen reader. The other thing that I learned not too long ago is that inline images are necessary for a screen reader to locate that image on a document. So if it's in a Word document, you need to be sure that you're using inline images as much as possible. If the inline images aren't possible, you can consider converting your document to an Adobe PDF, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. Considerations in PowerPoint, use the pre-formatted slide layouts. So this is in PowerPoint when you look for, say, a title slide or a slide with a title and a content box. If you can try to use those, it helps label those items for a screen reader, and it just makes it a little bit easier to get that document situated in a screen reader friendly format. Now that doesn't mean that you can't move those items around, but if you use the pre-formatted slide layouts, they're tagged correctly. So a title is tagged as a title instead of a random text box. So don't feel like you have to use the pre-formatted slide with everything in the exact location that it gives it to you. You can reorganize that slide a little bit and it'll still maintain those useful content tags like this is the title and this is a content box. And that's really helpful for screen readers. Another thing that you need to be mindful of, particularly if you're distributing slides for someone who might be using a screen reader, is that each slide needs a unique title. If a slide does not have a unique title, it could be pretty easy for someone to get disoriented in the document if a screen reader reads out slide one twice in a row. Is your screen reader stuck somewhere, or did you advance in the document? So just kind of be mindful of that if you're distributing the slides, that a unique title is very helpful for a screen reader trying to communicate that information. And then avoid all those design suggestions provided by PowerPoint. So the things with like the blue and orange backgrounds and all the pretty shapes, not all of those are accessible. And I can tell you from personal experience, trying to make those accessible, it takes a lot of time. So it's not ideal. So, stick with the simpler templates and avoid those designs that are recommended or provided in PowerPoint. So continuing on with document formatting, you'll see at the top at the title, I created this as if we will distribute the slides later because we may very well link to these on the website if you all want them. I have document formatting continued. So if someone were consuming this content with a screen reader, they would know that we're still talking about document formatting, but we are on the second page. So with PDFs, if you're going to create a PDF from a Word document or a PowerPoint, use the Save as Adobe PDF button. This helps with the document conversion, and the document comes out a lot closer to passing the accessibility requirements if you save it in this way. You also need your content to be tagged in a PDF, which you can learn more about using some of the resource links that we'll have provided at the end. And then another thing, as we move to so many digital documents, I'm not sure how many people have scanned documents that they were handing out as flyers or anything like that. But just, I wanted to make a special note that if you happen to have paper documents in your possession that you're planning to scan and distribute via email or post on a website or something, you're going to need to use Adobe Acrobat to run what's called optical character recognition. What basically happens is when you scan a document, it is scanned in as an image. The computer does not recognize that as text, and it's very difficult because a screen reader can't read it. So anyone relying on a screen reader is told it's an image, when in reality there's a bunch of text that they need to know about on there. So optical character recognition is really helpful. And with most modern fonts, it does a really good job. And so I recommend you learn that skill. And it's also helpful if you have historical documents that were not accessible. Other best practices to think about, whether you're creating a Word document, a PowerPoint, or a PDF, descriptive hyperlinks. So this would mean, I have an example of this on the right. So https cfas.osu.edu, yada, 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 all the way through. Or a clickable link that says accessibility, making extension events welcoming to all. If you wouldn't mind typing in the chat box, which of those do you think is more helpful to a person that might be relying on a screen reader to help them navigate? Right, the bottom one is generally, more helpful. Now, the caveat to this is you need to think about your distribution. If you're distributing this to an audience you know is going to print this, that clickable link may not be all that helpful. But in general, with our digital documents, the descriptive hyperlinks are the way to go. They're certainly more user-friendly. And yes, good point, Debbie. Go links, yes. And that's another point on my list. The Go links are a good way to go as well for those longer, ugly URLs. That can also help if you run into constituents that have like firewall issues and they can't click on content and be redirected from a PDF to the internet. Some people's computers are set to not allow that. So that's also another consideration, is to use go.osu links for longer URLs. Those are handy. Another thing that we don't often think about but is really important is where those links actually go. We want to make sure that we are linking to credible information, stable websites that work routinely like they're supposed to, and that they're accessible. You can go explore with WebAIM and check web pages to see how accessible they are. And some of them are great and some of them are not so great. And so if you're linking to a website and you find out that none of the images have alternate text or the links don't work or something like that, that's not very helpful for your audience. So we want to be mindful about the websites we're linking to. And then the other consideration I have on this list is to only use tables when absolutely necessary. Use them for information that lends itself well to a table. Try not to rely on tables for simply formatting something. Tables can be a little bit challenging, not only for screen readers, but for you as a person who's trying to create an accessible document. Sometimes they can be a little tricky. So use those tables when you have tabular information, but if it doesn't need to go in a table, don't rely on the table to format. And a second ago, I just mentioned alt text, kind of ahead of myself here. And thanks, Eric, for that information in the chat box. So with alt text, this basically puts text behind an image. So it allows a screen reader to communicate that information to someone who is relying on a screen reader someone's most likely visually impaired, but again, we might have users who like to hear the information. So this alt text is meant to provide images or alt text is meant for images conveying content. It doesn't necessarily have to be on everything. So if you have like a divider line on a slide that you used for more of a formatting issue, you can mark that as decorative and the screen reader can skip it. But if there's an image that you want to make sure that a person with a screen reader can experience as part of the content, add alt text to that, and that can be found in the properties of the image, or in the settings of the properties of the settings. And you want to manually check alt text for accuracy. Some of the more modern software will assign alt text to pictures, and it's not always accurate. For example, I was working on a document for a group that included some livestock images, and the automatically generated alt text said birthday cake. It was a picture of a goat. So that's not particularly helpful if the alt text is wrong. So be sure to check the alt text for accuracy. And then if you have images that have lengthy alt text, you might consider adding a caption. And just the main difference there is that a caption also provides an explanation of an image or a graph or a chart for a person who is just reading the document without a screen reader. So everybody has access to that. And that's also a time to consider your audience. If you have a really complicated chart that's going with like a fact sheet or something, you might want to put a caption on that so the users have better access to the take-home message and they don't get bogged down in all the data. So this also can just be a usability issue. Let's take another moment to kind of think about how we might do this on our own. Does anybody want to type in the chat box how you might write alt text for the image on this slide? Thanks, Tim. So, whoops. Oh dear. Okay, there we go. Yep, we've got a couple more. So the nice part about these alt text examples here is they're all very good. We want to keep alt text short. The general recommendation is like 2 sentences or less. And this can also be really simple or more elaborate. And this also just kind of depends on the need to communicate part of an image. And you'll notice as you work on accessibility that everybody kind of has a little bit of their own style to handle alt text and things like that. And it all works. It's fine. Everybody is going to have a little bit different style, and that's perfectly fine. So we're going to move on from alt text. Okay, Eric's got a great point in here that charts with data may need a link to a longer summary in place of alt text or a caption. Yes, if it's really complicated, that would be, a great idea. Oops, I missed another one. So there's another comment coming in the chat. Yes, an alt text is not a duplicate of a caption. Very good. Yes, thank you, Tim. So closed captions and audio description. Closed captions are something we really need to think about as we are doing videos and webinars. These are all required to have closed captions. The nice part about Zoom is if you record to the cloud as we are doing today, the closed captions will be generated by the Otter platform that is integrated into Zoom. It is a little bit tricky to provide live streamed captions, but if you communicate to your audience that a recording will be available with closed captions, that will be really helpful for those who need them. And just make sure to communicate that closed captions will be available in the recording. Currently, our primary option for live streaming captions with a webinar in Zoom is to have someone like manually type all those out, and it's quite a process, and not too many people, I think, have a skill to do that really well. So that's a bit of a challenge, but the Zoom cloud recordings are really amazing for providing closed captions for free. With videos, one of the ways that we typically handle videos, at least with LOD, and you're if you have an existing YouTube account, you can use YouTube to generate captions through artificial intelligence, and that is free. You probably have to check them for accuracy. We do want our captions to be accurate. They're not as helpful if they're not. But YouTube, is not an approved tool, so we need to keep that to public information only. Zoom cloud recording is approved, so internal data can be recorded to the cloud. YouTube and Otter AI, that's next in the list, are for public data only. And with Otter AI, you could take maybe a webinar that was already recorded, but you accidentally recorded it to your computer instead of the cloud. You can upload that webinar to Otter AI and get a text file, and then you'll have to sync those captions to actually create the timestamps for the closed captions using Adobe Premiere Pro, which is provided by the university, so you don't have to pay for that. There are paid services available, but those are pretty cost prohibitive. So, it's ideal to use the free services as much as we can. Nora's got a question in here. Could closed captions be in other languages? Yeah, you can provide closed captions in another language. There are often ways in video players to allow several files to be selected by a user. So you could have English captions or Spanish or Vietnamese or whatever other language you need. If you can find the professional to do it, right? I think that might be a barrier. Is that if we're going to be translating these into another language, that translation needs to be accurate. So certainly I encourage that. That's a great step in inclusion and accessibility, and it's wonderful. But we need to make sure that that translation is accurate, which, depending on the topic, could be straightforward or a little more complicated. But those are our options for captioning for free, and captioning is required. So be sure that you are exploring that as you are creating videos or recording webinars. This other item that doesn't get talked about quite as much is audio description, and that narrates what is happening in a video for a visually impaired user. And the tricky part is not all video players support audio description. YouTube does not. Vimeo, which I don't think anybody's using at the current juncture because it's not free and it's also not an approved tool, does not support audio description. Eric, do you know if MediaSite does? I didn't get a chance to look at that.
I do not know.
Okay, so that's something for us to explore. And one thing to keep in mind too is this statistic on the side about closed captions. 80% of people using closed captions are not hearing impaired. And I invite you to take a moment to think and maybe type in the chat box when you might use closed captions, even though technically maybe you don't have to have them. Right, watching a BBC show when you don't want to disturb your spouse, watching something on the TV, learning something new when there's a lot of background noise or a crowded audience or a crowded office. Very good. And they help your daughter hear better. She has a processing disorder, right? You know, there's all kinds of, in a noisy setting, there's all kinds of reasons you might want to use closed captions. And personally, sometimes I just get tired of noise. And so I want to, whoops, sorry about that. I probably just made you all dizzy. I turn them on simply because I'm tired of noise. So, and Tim's got, oh, we might have a mute issue. Okay, so let's continue on. Thank you everyone for participating in that little activity. It's nice to help us kind of think outside the box. And one final consideration that I think is more prevalent now that we aren't all on campus, we have families sharing spaces in internet bandwidth with each other, is designing your content for the devices people have available and being mindful of the internet capabilities of those that are consuming our content. A primary example would be this PowerPoint file that I'm sharing with you today. It has the original file has several high resolution images in it that made it gigantic. That would be very difficult for someone with a slow internet connection to download and view. And so I compressed all of the images to make that file smaller. Changing things to a PDF is another good way to limit file size. So limiting file sizes and being mindful of the software that people have at their disposal to view your content. So PDFs are really great. They're really readable across platforms. But you know, if someone is accessing something from like an iPhone, that you also need to be mindful of screen size and different things like that. So just kind of think about your audience and where they're likely to be connecting from. You know, if you're reaching a teen audience, there's a pretty good chance they're probably going to be on their phones. Where if you're reaching a professional development audience in the industry, they might have a work laptop that they can use. But depending on their setup, they might have some internet connectivity issues that poses their own challenges. So I just encourage everybody to be mindful of that, even though that isn't necessarily like an ADA consideration. This is still very much a usability consideration. And when we are proactive, like Laura mentioned, we can just make consuming that content so much more enjoyable, so much more valuable for all of our end users. So I just encourage you to think about the considerations as you're designing content, because it just makes the content work a lot better for everyone. And I'm going to hand it over now to Eric to talk more about digital accessibility policy for us.
Sorry, I was muted. So I guess I'm just here to kind of give a kind of brief overview of what I'm doing and about the policy that exists right now. As Laura said at the beginning, one of the things to note is it feels like this is all new because there's a piece of it that's new, but the reality is that the university has had basically the same digital information policy for more than 10 years. And what has changed in the last few years is there was a legal judgment and a agreement with the Office of Civil Rights about how we track our compliance with that digital accessibility policy. And so that's why everything feels kind of new, and there's a big push because now we have to keep track of how we are implementing that policy and that everybody is doing it. So each unit had to appoint a digital accessibility coordinator to coordinate that, and that was me for CFAS. And basically this comes down to a few different areas, which I kind of made the bullet points, and I was going to go through each one a little bit. One is policy and skills training. Everyone late last year was assigned, when I say everyone, the college decided on a group of people, was assigned a training that went over what the digital accessibility policy is and what digital accessibility is in general. It's one of these half-hour Buckeye Learn things. In theory, we're working on assigning everybody that again this year. It'll be a yearly training, just like the security policy or the sexual harassment policy, stuff like that, that people across the university have to kind of take to keep refreshed in their mind. On top of that, the Central University Unit is working on providing a set of skills training to everybody across the university. There's nice webinars like this, and I know that Danae and some other people have been involved in some other webinars for people to teach them how to do accessibility. But we also are working on eventually having a set of training available for people that they would be able to take in context with their job, with what kind of things they'd be producing. And like for things like PDFs, when you are normally making PDFs, we'll have a resource that we can point you to say, hey, these are the considerations and the things you need to do when you make PDFs. And so I know that that's in the works out there, but that'll be one of the things that is available soon. The college has a central form for handling any complaints or requests for accommodation, and all of our websites link to it in the footer. And it's definitely appropriate that in any kind of communication about something that you have coming up, that you might put in some of that publication somewhere, a disclaimer about accessibility. And if you need help with that, I can help with that. And this form, if not yourself, would be where you'd link them to. You can find it at cfas.osu.edu/A11Y. And it is a simple form that comes to us that just says, hey, I need help with this. And then I try and help find the person that can help them with that. The other thing that we're doing is anytime anyone has a quote unquote new implementation or major upgrade of some kind of digital information service or application, we have to review that for accessibility. And the idea here is that we know that we've done lots of things online that are inaccessible over the years, and we're going to work on getting to those. But right now, what we're trying to do is do our best to make sure that that all the new stuff that we're doing, that we are keeping record of where it's not accessible and how we would accommodate people, but also trying to make sure that we're reviewing things that are accessible. What that looks like right now is that we, when someone purchases an application or not necessarily purchase, decides to do something like today we were looking at in another meeting, how 4-H will do their evaluations of projects that come in and stuff, is how that process works. And we apply a risk matrix from the university to it, to what kind of audience is looking at it. And then we have to do a different kind of test regimen for accessibility based on that risk. And things that are inaccessible, we then would apply for an exception from the university. And those exceptions are all based around the idea of, we understand that sometimes things can't be accessible. And what is the accommodation plan? How will you deal with when somebody comes forward and wants to participate in this program, but can't do it in the way that you have regularly put out there? And so don't fret that this thing that you want to do that you won't be able to do because you know part of it is not accessible. It's always about, like I said, I understand the word exception in it, but I always think of these more as registering the accommodation plan with the university. It's telling them, we still need to do this. This is how we will handle it to make it so that everyone has equal access to it, which is what we need to do under the law. And then the last thing I put here is still in its early days, but even though we're trying to catch all the new things, eventually, which we've started with a little bit of work on trying to create an inventory of the web environment, including the u.osu sites, is going back and looking at everything we have and determining scans that we can run on it and tests that we can run on it, and trying to bring everything that we have into compliance. And so I guess at the end of the day, what to get to from this is why when you go to buy something, I end up sending you annoying emails. And if you do have some process that doesn't involve buying something, but it is kind of a new kind of digital service, to use the term determination from the university. If you give me a heads up, I will be happy to work with you to make sure that it is in compliance with what the policy is supposed to be. That's what I got.
Thanks, Eric. Could you maybe quickly give us a brief overview of the accessibility review process, like start to finish, considerations, timeline, cost?
Sure. So the review process, now it definitely has been, like what's official on paper of it is definitely built around applications, because most times when you have a service, it is, you know, I want to use this Flipgrid to do this, you know, this application. But sometimes it's not an application, sometimes it is the service as a whole. So, but someone comes to us and they say, I want to do X. Then what we're asking them is about the use cases for X. Okay, what kind of users are coming to it and what do they need to do? So this user needs to come to this website and be able to log in. Okay, who is that user? Are they an OSU employee? Are they a member of the public? Or are they students on a academic track? So we then apply that to a risk matrix, because to the university, employees of the college, they're a known audience. If they have a need for accessibility accommodation, we kind of know that, or we will know it as we're going to hire them and stuff like that, so we can plan for accommodation in advance for that person. And so they're a lower risk to the university for some kind of legal action. Then when you get into, so we look at numbers of those. So if it's like under 100 to 500 employees or something, this is not considered like a high risk to the university. So we can run what we call a quick test on that application, which in theory is basically trying to catch the low-hanging fruit of accessibility issues. And that's going around and looking at the color contrast of things and trying to use a keyboard to perform the actions the user would do. And that covers that covers most of the low-hanging stuff for screen readers, but then also covers for users with mobility issues, because they would use a keyboard or a keyboard replacement to get around the application, whatever it is. Then the next thing, they give us 4 levels, but really there's only 2 levels to this, because there's a lower level where we do this quick test, and then there's a higher level, which is 2 of different qualifications. And that is if it at all involves students in their academic track, or if it involves the public. And for both of those, it becomes the highest accessibility rating for the university. And for that right now, the requirement is that we get what they call a manual test. And that is an external test done by one of the 3 university approved vendors. I will say these are not cheap. We have not, as a college, actually done one yet. We've gotten a few quoted, but in the cases where we've gotten them quoted, we've ended up doing some kind of accommodation plan and exception around those things. We are working on a way to do an exception and accommodation plan, and then our own internal testing for internally developed applications. But that hasn't been officially approved yet. So even for like our web environment, like all the standard Drupal sites you see, those are considered existing software, not new implementations. So we have an exception in place for that right now for new websites on that. But when we get a new web platform, we in theory will have to test that somehow. And we're working with the university on how that works. So any kind of new service has to kind of be judged by that. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, that's really helpful for some perspective. Looks like we've got around 10 minutes left. I'm opening the floor for questions. If you all have questions for Laura or Eric or myself, we'd be happy to answer them. And I'm going to advance the screen here. We have some resources that I think everyone will be find that everyone will find useful. And we can post these slides along with this recording on the website, so you can go back and reference these later. So we've got a link to creating accessible documents and links, accessibility basics for websites, the Digital Accessibility Center, the ODE Resource Center regarding accessibility. Laura's got some nice materials on Ohio Agribility. And we've got the site that Eric mentioned earlier to submit requests for disability accommodation, and the two sites that I mentioned earlier in regards to website accessibility and color contrast checking at WebAIM. So these will be some really helpful things as you all venture out to create your own accessible content. Let's see, we've got a question in the chat box from Diana. Are go.osu links preferred over YouTube links for accessibility? I would say that if you are creating a printed document where they're going to be trying to type that link into their own web browser to visit, a go.osu link is definitely preferable. In a digital situation, you may be able to just type the title of that video and then create a hyperlink that provides a descriptive hyperlink to your YouTube video. And if it's a website or something, you may be able to embed the video so they don't even have to leave that location to view the content.
Yeah, as long as you're able to use a custom name on a hyperlink when it's an actual hyperlink, then the difference between YouTube and go.osu doesn't really matter, because the text you're displaying is that descriptive text that you're giving. Where Amy's talking about, yeah, is in print, where the YouTube URL is just random letters, whereas the go.osu would allow you to give it a name that's readable and typable a little easier.
Well, we'll give it a few more minutes. We'll wait here if anyone comes up with any questions as they get a chance to kind of collect their thoughts. But I would like to take a moment to really say thank you to Laura and Eric for joining us today. I really appreciate your help as we try to tackle accessibility in digital content offered by Extension. Thank you for joining us today.
No, they are not. It is an issue we're working with. The branding templates that, well, let me provide that. There are templates provided from the university. The ones that come to my mind are email. I haven't looked into the other ones, but that's why we specifically switched over our newsletter system to use the university email templates, because they are rated to be accessible and all that kind of stuff, and we'll use email and ACID to review them when we're doing emails internally. But as far as the other branding templates, I don't know about the university ones, but I know the college ones, we have not specifically gone through and tested them for accessibility. I will say, by the letter of the policy, they predate the scanning, so they're not new implementation yet. But when we refresh those, we would definitely have to make sure that they do, in the same ways that Amy's talking about for the standard ones for PowerPoint, where the title would be tagged and stuff like that.
And Cassie, you have full ability to kind of look through those in the templates. If you visit the go.osu.edu/access links and look at the how to create accessible documents, that can kind of coach you through adjusting that in PowerPoint.
The short answer to your question, Cassie, by default, I have to say no, because we haven't looked at them for that. But it's always plausible that the person that made them when they made them last, which was a couple years ago, did tag them properly. I just assume that they did not.
This is Cheryl. I have a meeting on Friday with our communications project lead, so I will ask.
I'm sure they'll just ask me.
Probably. I'll say you already answered that. We're just double checking.
Yeah, I mean, it's that we need to put them through like a test to verify. But yeah, it is something that I've brought up before that we probably need to look at redoing those for accessibility.
And so if we're making PowerPoint, or not PowerPoint, sorry, PDFs now, but we don't have the document that you guys talked about that tells us all the things that we need to check.
Right.
Is there someone we send these to review? Because
so there are third-party vendors that cost money. But I will say that for PDFs, when we say the things that you're supposed to check, the document that we're going to pass around for PDFs, what it's basically going to say, and is that Adobe Acrobat has a built-in accessibility checker in it. Now, it's not perfect. None of these automated tools are. But if you go in the, I mean, I don't have step-by-step instructions for me, but if you Google it, you'll find the instructions. But basically, when you go to the tools menu in Acrobat, you go to, I think, more tools and start typing accessibility. You should find there's an accessibility tool platform in Adobe Acrobat. And one of the options there is accessibility checker. And it will look at your document and it will then tell you, you know, these are the things you should look at. Now, it can't tell you if your alt text is sufficiently descriptive. It can just tell you if there's alt text there. And so it'll call it out and tell you, hey, take a look at this. But it will look to see if like titling is on tags and stuff like, tags are on things like titles and stuff. Amy did post a link in the chat, so.
And as you practice, you get faster at this. So it's a learning curve, but I promise it gets easier.
yeah, I guess what I was asking was like right now, when we have something and we need it checked for branding, then we email it to branding, branding checks it, refers it back to us. So like, is this something that branding is going to start checking in addition to the visual piece?
I do not have a answer for you other than that has not been discussed by branding with me at all, and I would doubt they would be.
So how do we ensure that the documents that are being put out there are accessible? I mean, like who's auditing that or who's tracking that, or how is that, other than the honor system, which I understand, but
Yeah.
I'm just.
You have a good point, but in for documents, so according to the letter of the policy, which is not what we would be doing, and everyone agrees that, it's almost as if every PDF in the college would need to be tested and go through me, which is not going to happen. But what the internal group has said, and what I'm talking about with the kind of standard guidance that'll be coming out, is for things that are single documents like this. What we're trying to do is then provide you eventually here guidance on how to make it. And then yes, I guess the honor system sort of, but it's the honor system in that you're an employee and it's your responsibility to do it that way. So I don't know how much of the honor system that is, other than we're providing the training on how to do your job and then you have to do it, you know? So.
And this is only for things that we create. It's not for other, like if we're linking something from another entity on our website, that's.
Well, that is a door of its own. And we had a little bit of a conversation about this when it comes down to there are oddities with extension that would be exceptions to this, I'm sure, which we talked about a little bit last week. But the reality is that what we link to, as it depends on the context we're linking to it. If it's just, hey, there's this information online about this thing that we're talking about, okay. But if you're telling a student or a participant in your program that this is a resource they should use to participate in this program, and you're linking to something that's inaccessible, you should be prepared to offer accommodation for that, because that is becoming a material part of participation in the program. It's the same thing as if in a physical sense, when we buy textbooks or assign certain textbooks to courses, if a student has an accessibility need where they can't use that textbook, it's on the university to provide an accommodation for how they'll be able to have that resource and participate in that program. So we still, if it is, it's a little bit of a judgment call there. And yes, we're not making all of the judgments, you're making some of the judgments, but if it is somehow materially related to the program, then yeah, it would be wrong to link to something that's inaccessible and not be prepared to accommodate for it.
Thank you.
Well, I see we're at the top of the hour. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Great questions. Thank you for your participation in the activities that we had. We'll be posting the recording on the LOD website. I don't know if anybody has that website handy to paste in the chat box. But we will post it there. We'll also post a copy of the slides because I recognize not everybody may have been able to grab the resource links that you will find helpful as you get started building your own accessible content. Thanks, Danae.
Thank you, Amy.